I was helping my daughter color at a cafe window table when she suddenly stopped and whispered, "Daddy, that lady looks sad." I looked up and saw her, a woman trying to disappear into the wall, invisible to everyone but my child. And in that moment, I had to decide, do I stay silent like the rest or invite her to sit? The cafe buzzed with the familiar rhythm of a weekday morning. Cups clinked against saucers, steam hissed from the espresso machine, and a low hum of conversation filled every corner. Businessmen leaned over laptops, brows furrowed in focus. Students sat hunched under the weight of textbooks, pens moving steadily across lined pages. Friends huddled together in animated chatter, their laughter spilling like warm sunlight across polished tables. It was a place alive with noise, comfort, and connection. And yet, for one woman, it felt like a stage where she did not belong. Sarah stood by the entrance, her hand clutching the strap of her worn-out bag so tightly her knuckles whitened. The leather was frayed at the edges, softened by years of use, and its weight pressed heavily against her chest like a shield. She scanned the cafe with searching eyes, first hopeful, then faltering, as table after table seemed to reject her silently. A businessman glanced up, then quickly backed down at his screen. A group of students shifted their books closer together, closing off the empty chair beside them. Others simply pretended not to notice her at all, lifting their mugs or leaning into private conversations as though her presence might disturb the delicate balance of their morning rituals. Her clothes, though neat, carried the unmistakable marks of wear. The hem of her blouse was slightly faded, her shoes scuffed but carefully tied. She had done her best, as she always did, to look presentable. But no matter how much effort she poured into appearances, there was no hiding the exhaustion that lingered on her face, no concealing the way her shoulders curved inward as if under a weight no one else could see. Sarah tried to make herself smaller, standing near the corner where shadows from the tall windows met the wall. She told herself she would only wait a few minutes, that perhaps a seat would free up, that someone would notice and offer. Yet, as the moments dragged on, her body grew stiffer, her gaze dimmer. She could feel the heat rising behind her eyes, not from anger, but from a loneliness so sharp it pressed into her chest. To anyone looking, she might have seemed just another customer waiting her turn. But her stillness, her silence, carried a different truth. She was not waiting for coffee. She was waiting to be acknowledged, to be seen. Around her, the world carried on, bright, noisy, oblivious. And she remained, a quiet figure in the corner of a crowded room, invisible in plain sight. At the window table, sunlight pooled across a half-finished sketchbook. Daniel sat there, his coffee cooling slowly in front of him, his attention fixed not on the drink, but on the little girl beside him. Lily hummed tunelessly as she filled the page with bursts of color, bright red swirls, uneven blue circles, a row of stick figures holding hands. She pressed the crayon so hard the paper bent, then looked up at her father with an expectant grin. "Pretty good, huh?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly, brushing a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. "Better than good," he said. "That's a masterpiece." Her giggle bubbled out, light and unguarded, a sound that softened the edges of the busy cafe around them. For Daniel, moments like this made the long nights and early mornings worth it. Just him and Lily, quiet anchors for one another in a world that often felt unsteady. But Lily's laughter paused suddenly. Her eyes, round and observant, wandered across the room. She noticed the woman standing alone, shifting uncomfortably near the wall, her fingers tangled nervously around her bag strap. While the adults buried themselves in work and chatter, Lily simply stared, puzzled, at the sight of someone who looked like they didn't belong. She tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, leaning close so only he could hear. Daniel glanced down. "What is it, sweetheart? Why is that lady standing? Everyone else has a chair." Her small brow furrowed. She looked sad. The simplicity of the question caught Daniel off guard. He followed his daughter's gaze and finally saw her. Really saw her. The way she hovered like a shadow at the edge of the room, her shoulders tense as though bracing for rejection. He felt something stir, a flicker of recognition, maybe, or an ache he remembered from his own past. Lily tugged again, more insistent this time. "She shouldn't stand there, Daddy. She needs a seat." Daniel exhaled slowly. He could have ignored it, told Lily to finish her drawing. kept the moment easy and self-contained. But his daughter's words pressed into him with the weight of truth children often carry. They see what grown-ups learn to overlook. So he lifted his hand, his voice calm but steady. "Excuse me," he called across the noise of clinking cups and muted conversations. His eyes met the woman's. "Would you like to join us?" For a heartbeat, Sarah didn't move. She looked toward the table near the window, uncertain that the invitation was really meant for her. The man's hand was still raised slightly, palm open in quiet welcome, his expression steady but kind. The little girl beside him had turned fully in her chair, her expectant smile urging Sarah forward as if she were already part of their small circle. Her throat tightened. How long had it been since someone offered her something as simple as a seat without hesitation, without suspicion? A dozen thoughts crashed through her mind. Maybe he doesn't really mean it. Maybe I'll only be in the way. Maybe they'll regret it as soon as I sit down. But the girl's wide eyes held no judgment, only the warmth of innocence. That was enough. Sarah's voice came out soft, almost fragile. "Thank you." She pulled the chair back carefully, trying not to scrape the floor too loudly, and lowered herself into it with an awkward grace. Her bag remained clutched against her chest for a moment longer. Then, realizing she must look nervous, she rested it gently at her feet. The little girl leaned across the table, her crayon-streaked fingers pushing the open sketchbook towards Sarah. "You can help me if you want," she said, her words bubbling with sincerity. Something inside Sarah cracked open. A faint smile touched her lips, the first real flicker of light she'd felt all morning. She reached for a crayon, her fingers trembling slightly, as if she'd forgotten how to take part in something so simple. "I'd love to," she murmured. Daniel watched the exchange quietly. He didn't interrupt, didn't press Sarah with questions. Instead, he let the child lead, sensing that this gentle bridge between strangers was stronger than anything he could construct with words. As Sarah colored beside Lily, her shoulders loosened bit by bit, as though the invisible weight she carried had shifted slightly off-center. She wasn't laughing, not yet, but there was a softness in her face that hadn't been there when she stood alone by the wall. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't intruding. For the first time and longer still, she felt seen. The crayons lay scattered across the table, bright little fragments of color against the polished wood. Lily had moved on to humming again, absorbed in her drawing, her focus darting back and forth between filling in the sky and sneaking glances at Sarah. The child's acceptance was total and immediate. She didn't question who Sarah was or why she was sitting with them. To Lily, it was enough that the woman had been standing alone, and now she wasn't. Daniel sipped his coffee, letting the moment breathe. He could sense Sarah's hesitation, the way she kept smoothing her blouse nervously, her eyes drifting toward the window as if bracing for an excuse to leave. Yet there was also a subtle pull in her posture, a quiet desire to stay. "Thank you again," she said suddenly, her voice low but steady, "for inviting me." Daniel gave a small nod. "It's no trouble." He didn't add more, but the openness in his tone invited her to continue if she wished. Her gaze lowered to the crayon in her hand. For a moment, she just rolled it between her fingers, the paper wrapping peeling slightly at the edge. Then, almost without deciding, the words slipped out. "It's been a while since anyone's asked me to sit with them." Daniel stayed silent, waiting. "I moved here not long ago," she continued. "I thought it would be a fresh start, but it feels like I brought all the weight with me." Her lips trembled as she tried to force a smile that didn't quite land. "Some days it's like I'm invisible, like I could disappear in a crowd and no one would notice." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He knew that feeling, the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being unseen. Sarah drew in a shaky breath. "My husband." She stopped, swallowed hard, and tried again. "He left, at the worst possible time. I thought marriage meant having someone to hold on to when everything falls apart. But when my life unraveled, he just walked away." Her words cracked at the edges. She quickly pressed her lips together, as if regretting saying so much. But Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't offer hollow sympathy or quick reassurances. He simply nodded, his eyes steady on hers, a quiet acknowledgement that her pain had landed. After a long pause, he spoke softly. "I know what that's like. Different circumstances, maybe, but I know." She glanced at him, curious but cautious. "My wife passed when Lily was just a baby," Daniel said. He didn't speak of it often, but something about Sarah's trembling voice called it out of him. There were nights I thought I wouldn't make it to morning. Days when people looked at me like I was broken, or worse, like I wasn't capable of raising her alone. His hand rested briefly on the table, fingers tapping once before curling into a fist. It nearly broke me. But here we are. Their eyes held for a moment. In that silence, layered with grief and recognition, something unspoken passed between them. Not pity, not judgment, but the raw bond of people who had both been left behind. The first time had felt accidental, like a kindness extended out of nowhere. But the second time, and the third, it began to feel like something more, a rhythm slowly taking shape. Whenever Daniel brought Lily to the cafe after school, Sarah seemed to appear as well. Sometimes she entered cautiously, scanning the crowded room as though expecting rejection. Other times she lingered outside the door for a moment before pushing it open, as if gathering courage. But each time, Daniel or Lily would wave her over, and the hesitation would fade from her face. Their table by the window became something of a meeting place. Lily would chatter about her day, sliding her worksheets across the table for Sarah's help. Sarah bent over the pages with patient focus, guiding Lily's small hand as she practiced spelling words or solved math problems. "See? You already knew the answer," she'd encourage softly, and Lily's face would brighten in response. And then there were the songs. One afternoon, Lily started humming again, this time stumbling over the words to a tune she'd half learned at school. Sarah surprised them both by softly finishing the line, her voice hesitant at first, then growing steadier. Lily's eyes lit up. "You know it," she exclaimed, and soon the two of them were singing together, their mismatched voices weaving through the noise of the cafe like threads of color on an otherwise gray canvas. Daniel often found himself sitting back, simply watching. He noticed how Lily's laughter sounded different when Sarah was near, richer, more unguarded. He noticed, too, how Sarah herself seemed to transform in those moments. The deep lines of weariness softened when she smiled, and her posture, once closed and defensive, gradually opened as if she were relearning the shape of ease. Yet it wasn't only about Lily. In Sarah's quiet presence, Daniel felt something shift in himself. She never pressed him with questions about his long hours or the strain of balancing work and fatherhood. Instead, she simply sat with him, offering small nods, small smiles, and the steady companionship of someone who understood silence. For a man who had carried so much alone, it was a relief he hadn't realized he needed. They weren't family. Not yet, not in any official way. But in those afternoons, the cafe table felt like more than just a place to pass the time. It felt like a space where three lives, once fractured by loss, were slowly stitching themselves together. Outside the cafe, life was less forgiving. For all the warmth Sarah found with Daniel and Lily, the rest of the city felt like a series of locked doors. She applied everywhere: small offices, restaurants, retail shops. Each morning she ironed her blouse carefully, rehearsed answers in front of the mirror, and told herself that today would be different. But the pattern rarely changed. Some interviewers glanced at her resume and handed it back with polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Others listened distractedly, as though her words were background noise to their own plans. A few simply thanked her for coming in and promised to call, a promise she knew wouldn't be kept. Each rejection pressed heavier on her spirit. She began to dread the walk home, the way her footsteps echoed on the pavement, the way the silence of her apartment seemed to swallow her whole. By the time she reached her door, the effort of keeping her chin lifted in public collapsed into tired tears she wiped away before anyone could notice. One evening, after another long day of disappointment, she sat across from Daniel and Lily at their usual table. Her smile was practiced, but it wavered when Lily wasn't looking. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. "You okay?" he asked gently, once Lily had leaned over her sketchbook again. Sarah hesitated. She wanted to say yes, to pretend she was fine, but the words tasted bitter. She shook her head. "I'm so tired, Daniel. Every time I think I've found a chance, it slips away. I walk into those rooms, and I can see it in their faces before I even sit down. They don't see me as someone worth keeping." Her voice cracked, her hands twisting together on the table. "I don't know how much longer I can keep trying. Maybe I should just stop." The words hung heavy between them. Around them, the cafe bustled as always, cups clinking, conversations rising and falling. But at their table, the air felt still, weighted with the sharp edge of surrender. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, the hollow strain in her eyes. He remembered that same look in the mirror, years ago, when grief had nearly broken him. And though she didn't ask it outright, he knew what she needed was not advice, but something deeper, something that would remind her she wasn't invisible. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Sarah," he said firmly, "don't let the world tell you that you don't matter." She lifted her eyes, startled by the intensity in his tone. "I know what it feels like," he continued, his gaze steady on hers. "To walk into a room and feel smaller before you've even said a word. To carry so much weight that you start to believe you're invisible. But you're not." He paused, letting the silence underline his words. "You're stronger than you think. And Lily and I, we see you." The simplicity of the statement pierced through her defenses. For a moment, she had no words. Her throat tightened, and she blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears from spilling. She searched his face, half expecting to find pity there. But there was none. Only honesty. Only recognition. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded once, without hesitation. "I do." He gestured toward Lily, who was humming to herself as she colored, oblivious to the gravity at the table. "And so does she. Look at how she lights up when you're around. That doesn't happen if you're invisible." Sarah let out a shaky breath. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed someone to say those words, to push back against the endless rejection that had hollowed her out. For weeks, she had carried the thought that she was nothing but a burden, that kindness like his and Lily's was temporary, undeserved. But Daniel's voice carried no trace of obligation. It was conviction, plain and steady. "Thank you," she whispered finally, her fingers brushing at the corner of her eye. "I don't know what I'd do without you two." Daniel gave a small smile, not overly sentimental, but warm. "You don't have to know. Just don't give up yet. You're closer than you think." And in that moment, Sarah felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope, fragile but real, flickering like a small flame against the dark. The weeks that followed were not suddenly easy, but they were different. Sarah carried Daniel's words with her, turning them over in her mind like a pebble in her pocket. Something solid to hold on to when doubt threatened to swallow her whole. She kept applying, kept showing up, even when her confidence faltered. And then, one morning, the call came. A local bookstore had an opening. The pay wasn't much, but the manager had listened to her carefully, not rushing her answers, not dismissing her pauses. When he offered her the position, her breath caught, and for the first time in months, she felt the stirrings of belonging. On her first day, the scent of paper and ink wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. Stacks of novels lined the shelves, stories waiting to be touched, carried, shared. Sarah found herself smiling as she organized displays and rang up customers, her hands steady, her voice gaining strength with each transaction. It wasn't just a job. It was a place where she felt useful, where her presence made sense. That evening, she arrived at the cafe with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. Daniel noticed it instantly, the way her shoulders were straighter, the way her smile reached her eyes. "How was it?" he asked, sliding a cup of tea across the table to her. Sarah exhaled, almost laughing at the release of it. "It was good. Really good. I didn't feel out of place for once. I felt like I belonged." Lily clapped her hands together, beaming. "Can we visit you at the bookstore?" "Can we?" Sarah laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar but welcome in her own ears. "Of course. I'd love that." Daniel watched the exchange quietly, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and admiration. He knew how hard-won this moment was, how many nights she'd almost given up. And though his own days were still full, long hours of work, the constant juggle of parenting, he realized he had begun leaning on Sarah, just as she leaned on him. They weren't perfect. There were still struggles ahead. But sitting together at that table, sharing tea and laughter, Daniel could feel it. Something steady, something healing, taking root between them. The rain had been falling all afternoon, streaking the cafe windows with silver lines that blurred the busy street outside. Inside, though, the air was warm, carrying the familiar scent of roasted beans and baked pastries. Daniel and Lily sat at their usual table by the window, coats draped over the backs of their chairs, Lily bent over her sketchbook with a crayon tucked firmly in her small hand. When the door opened, Sarah stepped inside, shaking the rain from her umbrella. For a moment, she stood still, remembering the first time she had walked into this place. Back then, she had hovered awkwardly by the wall, invisible in the eyes of strangers. Now, her gaze lifted and immediately found them. Daniel waving her over with quiet assurance, Lily grinning wide enough to light the whole room. Her chest swelled with something she hadn't felt in years, certainty. She didn't have to wonder if she was welcome. She didn't have to steel herself against indifference. This time, she knew exactly where she belonged. She crossed the room, her steps unhurried, her smile unguarded. Daniel pulled out the chair for her without a word, and she sat down, the three of them falling into an easy rhythm as though it had always been this way. Lily pushed her sketchbook across the table. "You're coloring with me today," she announced, no trace of doubt in her voice. Sarah laughed, a full, rich sound that startled even her. It wasn't polite or careful, it was real, born from a heart no longer weighed down by shame. She picked up a crayon and leaned in, her hand steady as she joined Lily in filling the page. Daniel sipped his coffee, watching them both with quiet contentment. He remembered the woman who had once stood alone by the wall, her eyes dim with defeat. And he saw now the woman seated across from him, her smile radiant, her spirit slowly stitching itself whole again. The cafe that had once been a place of exclusion had transformed into something else entirely. Not just a room full of noise and strangers, but the beginning of a story, one where kindness created family, and where being seen was enough to change everything. Sometimes, Daniel thought, it didn't take grand gestures or sweeping rescues. Sometimes all it took was a seat at the table. And Sarah, smiling as Lily pressed another crayon into her hand, knew he was right.